Arizona Territory, 1883. The sun had barely cleared the Red Bluff Ridge when the westbound train hissed into the depot at Benson, steam curling like ghosts in the dry morning air. Susanna Orley stood at the edge of the platform, her hands clenched around the worn handle of a scuffed satchel. Her black dress was faded from sun and sorrow, the hem dusty from weeks of walking dirt roads and waiting on benches just like this one. She had waited every morning for 12 days straight now, same time, same place, same hollow ache in her chest. A widow at 26. 2 years since cholera swept through their small ranch outside Tombstone, taking her husband, and less than a year since the bank took the land. She had nothing left but a name, a Bible, and the memory of a life that slipped through her fingers like water. Her eyes scanned the passengers stepping down from the train, soldiers, drummers, a few families but no one she recognized, no miracle. Not today either. Behind her, her son and daughter sat on the bench beneath the depot's overhang, legs swinging, dusty from travel. Amelia, only 4, clutched a cloth rabbit to her chest, her big eyes watching every man who passed. Adam, 6, had his arms crossed, jaw set in that way that reminded her too much of his father. "Is Papa coming today?" Amelia asked softly, voice thin as spider silk. "No, baby," Susanna said as gently as she could, kneeling down to fix the girl's bonnet. "Not today." "He is not coming at all," Adam muttered, not looking at them. Susanna's chest ached. She set her hand on his shoulder, but he shrugged her off and stared out toward the desert. She straightened up, her gaze lifting as a dust-covered horseman rode slowly up the road from the south. He was tall in the saddle, hat pulled low, a bedroll tied behind him and a rifle slung over his back. She could tell right away he was not from around here. His coat was too clean, his boots too fine, and he rode like a man who had been on the trail for weeks. He dismounted at the water trough, letting his sorrel gelding drink. Then he looked up and their eyes met. Something shifted behind his gaze. Not surprise, not interest, something deeper, quieter, recognition maybe, or just the kind of stillness that came from a man who had seen too much. He tipped his hat. "Morning." Susanna nodded, unsure what to say. The silence between them felt strange, full. She turned her eyes away, embarrassed by how long she had held his gaze. The cowboy tied his horse to the hitching post and walked toward the depot, boots scuffing softly on the dusty boards. He glanced at the children, then looked back at her. "You waiting on someone?" he asked, voice rough but not unkind. "I was," she said. "Not anymore." He looked at her a long moment. "You all right?" "No," she said, "but the sun's still rising, so I suppose I have to be." The corner of his mouth tugged into something close to a smile, but not quite. He looked like a man who did not smile often. He took off his hat, smoothing his dark hair back. "Name's Yates Whitlow, just rode up from Bisbee." Susanna Orley. She watched his eyes flick to her black dress, then to the children. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Long, 2 years." He blinked slowly, as if weighing something. "That's long enough to know the ache does not go away, it just gets quieter." She studied him then. His coat was worn, his hands calloused. He moved like a man who had been alone too long, carrying weight that did not belong to anyone else anymore. "You got family?" he asked. "No," she said. "Just us." The train whistled, spitting steam. Yates glanced back, then looked down at Adam and Amelia. "You folks headed somewhere?" "I do not know anymore," she said. "We were supposed to meet my brother, but he never came, might have never been coming." Yates was quiet, then he crouched in front of Adam. "What is your name, son?" Adam hesitated. "Adam, you looking after your mama?" Adam nodded once. Yates stood and looked back at Susanna. "You got food, some biscuits, water." "That is not enough. There is a boarding house down the street. You and the children should get a hot meal." "I cannot pay," she said flatly. "I did not ask you to." Susanna stared at him. "Why would you help us?" He looked her square in the eye. "Because I remember what it is like to be hoping someone would, and no one did." She did not move, did not speak. He reached into his coat and pulled out a silver dollar, pressed it into her palm. "Get them something warm. I will be back in an hour." "Where are you going?" "To see if the stables got room for my horse." "Then I will meet you at the boarding house." Susanna watched him walk away, unsure what to make of him. Something about the way he moved steady, like the world could tilt, and he would still stand, made her chest tighten. She had not felt anything like it in a long, long time. She looked down at the coin in her hand. It was warm from his fingers. An hour later, they sat in the small dining room of the boarding house. The children picked at stew and cornbread while Susanna sat stiff and silent. She was not used to kindness that did not come with a cost. Yates appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. He looked at her, then at the children. "Mind if I join you?" She nodded once. He sat across from her, quiet as always. The children watched him with wide eyes. "You got anywhere to stay tonight?" he asked. "No." He looked at the innkeeper. "She can have my room. I will sleep in the barn." "I cannot let you do that," Susanna said quickly. "You are not," he said. "I am offering." She blinked hard. "Why are you doing this?" Yates met her eyes. "Because I was riding through town and saw a woman standing at the depot like she was waiting for a miracle. And I thought maybe I could be one." Her breath caught. She stared at him, unable to speak. He stood, sliding his hat back on. "Sleep warm, Miss Orley. I will see you in the morning." And then he was gone, quiet as a shadow. That night, Susanna lay in a real bed for the first time in weeks. Amelia curled beside her. Adam slept on a cot by the window, but Susanna could not sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers tight around the coins still in her hand. She had come to the depot looking for a miracle, and maybe, just maybe, a cowboy had found her instead. The morning came slow, stained orange and violet across the eastern sky, the kind of light that made everything seem quieter than it was. Susanna sat at the edge of the bed, boots laced, her hair coiled into a loose knot. Amelia still slept, breath soft and even. Adam was already up, tracing his finger along the glass of the window, watching a drover lead a mule team through the street below. She hadn't meant to stay another night in Benson. But the thought of walking again without knowing where they were headed felt like stepping into open air. And Yates had said he'd return in the morning. Downstairs, the scent of coffee and frying cornmeal drew her to the kitchen. She carried a folded blanket in her arms, meaning to offer it back to the innkeeper in thanks, but stopped short when she saw Yates already seated at the long pine table, his plate half finished, hat resting beside him. "You're up early," she said, voice low. He glanced up. "Slept light." "Rooster in the barn kicks up a fuss come first light." She set the blanket on a chair. "I didn't expect you to stay. I figured you might need more than one hot meal and a warm bed," he said. "If you've no plans, I've got an idea." She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "What kind of idea?" "There's a family near Dragoon Wilson's. Husband broke his leg last month. They've got land, stock, and more work than hands to do it. I helped them finish a corral before I rode south. They're decent folks. Might take on someone steady if she's got children to help with chores." Susanna watched him carefully. "You're offering to take us there. I'm headed that way anyhow, and I figure it's better than waiting for someone who isn't coming." She didn't answer right away. A train whistle echoed faintly in the distance. She rubbed her thumb along the edge of the table. "You'd ride with a woman and her children through the desert just to drop them at some farm." Yates looked at her, steady. "I'd ride with you because I know what it is to be alone and not know where the next safe place is. And because you didn't flinch when I said my name." She blinked. "Why would I flinch? Most folks around here heard it before. My brother ran with the Blackleg Confederates during the war. He shot 3 men in Tucson last spring. They think the name means trouble." She stepped into the kitchen, closer now. "You're not your brother." "No," he said, setting down his fork, "but the name makes folks wary all the same." She met his gaze. "I don't scare easy." Something softened in his face just for a breath, then he stood, reaching for his hat. "We'll leave after breakfast if you're coming." She thought about the way Adam had stopped talking so much lately, about Amelia's dreams where she called out for her father, about the way her hands trembled sometimes without reason. "All right," she said. "We'll come." Outside, the town stirred with the slow rhythm of another day. A tinker's cart rattled past, and a woman across the way swept her stoop with determined strokes. Susanna packed what little they had into the satchel, tied it shut, and helped Amelia down the stairs while Adam carried the folded blanket. Yates stood with his horse, cinching the last strap on the saddle. A bay mare stood beside the gelding, smaller but sturdy, with a patch of white above one eye. He handed the reins to Susanna, borrowed her from the stableman, "Paid with the last of my poker winnings. You ride." Not since I had Adam, she said. You'll manage. She lifted Amelia into the saddle first, then swung up behind her. Adam climbed up behind Yates without being asked, arms wrapped tight around the cowboy's coat. They rode out of Benson just as the sun cleared the jagged peaks to the east. The land stretched wide and dry, low brush and red rock giving way to golden grass and scattered cottonwoods. Ocotillo stood tall and strange along the horizon, thin arms lifting skyward. By midday, they stopped near a dry creek where the shade was thickest. Yates unpacked dried apples and hard cheese, passing pieces to each child without a word. Susanna took hers last, sitting with her back against a mesquite trunk. You always planned to settle out here? He asked, breaking the silence. No, she said, brushing crumbs from her lap. We came west for his lungs. Doctor said the air might help. It didn't, he nodded once, chewing slowly. I came for the cattle draws, never took to Missouri winters, too wet, too many memories. You were a ranch hand for a while, then a trail boss. Then a little of everything. She looked at him sideways. And now, he wiped his hands on a square of cloth. Now I'm trying to find something that doesn't end in gunfire or whiskey. Susanna didn't speak for a while. The wind stirred the branches overhead. Amelia slept beside her, curled into her skirts. Adam sat cross-legged near the horses, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. Why'd you stop at the depot? She asked. I needed water for the horse. That all? He looked at her, the line of his jaw tight. No, I saw you. And I didn't want to keep riding. She felt the heat rise in her chest, not from the sun. You don't even know me. I know enough, he said. You keep going even when the road's empty. That tells me more than names ever could. She held his gaze a moment longer, then reached down and brushed a leaf from Amelia's hair. You said the Wilsons are decent folks. They are, and if they're not, we'll find another place. She looked out across the open land. The sky above was endless and blue, and for the first time in a long while she didn't feel like she was walking into nothing. You always keep your word, she asked. Only thing I've got left that's worth much, he said. She didn't smile. But something inside her shifted, slow and sure, like a door opening just enough to let in light. By the third day, the land had shifted. The flat desert had given way to low hills and scattered juniper, the air turning cooler beneath a ceiling of pale clouds. The horses moved at a steady pace, hooves muffled in the soft red dirt. Amelia rode with her arms snug around Susanna's waist, her head pressed to her back, while Adam sat taller behind Yates, asking quiet questions about the names of plants and birds. They stopped that afternoon near a shallow arroyo where the water still ran clear from spring, melt higher in the hills. While the horses drank, Susanna knelt by the edge to wet a cloth for Amelia's neck. The child had grown quiet again, her eyes heavy, and Susanna worried the travel wore on her more than she let on. She'll be fine, Yates said from behind her, not intruding, just close enough to see. She's holding stronger than most grown folks would. Susanna looked up at him. Hard to know what's too much when there's no other choice. He crouched beside her, dipping his hands into the stream. I was younger than Adam when I learned that. She studied him as he rubbed the water over the back of his neck. There was a long, faded scar just above his collar, nearly hidden by the edge of a sun-darkened shirt. She didn't ask about it. Instead, she said, "Have you ever thought of settling?" He poured water into his hands again, letting it run through his fingers. I did once. In Texas, before everything went sideways, there was a girl. Her father owned a feed store. What happened? She married a banker. Susanna smiled faintly, surprised by the softness in his voice. That's not sideways, that's just life. He looked over at her, his gaze steady. It was sideways for me. They didn't speak for a few moments. The wind moved through the brush, carrying the scent of juniper and dry earth. I was thinking, he said, shifting his weight as he stood, once we reach the Wilsons, I could stay through branding season. They'll need an extra set of hands. She wrung out the cloth and laid it over Amelia's neck. That's generous. I'd prefer not to ride off just yet. Susanna stood slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. You don't owe us anything. I know. She looked at him then, really looked. I'm not sure I know how to trust someone who doesn't want something in return. I don't blame you, he said, but I'm not asking for anything. Adam called out from the far side of the arroyo. There's a trail here. It goes up over the ridge. We'll take it, Yates said, already moving toward the boy. Might shave an hour off. They climbed through the narrow pass in the late light of day, the sky turning the color of copper. At the top, the land opened wide again, rolling grassland, scattered with low rock outcrops and cottonwood groves. A narrow line of smoke curled in the distance. That's them, Yates said, pointing toward a cluster of buildings along a shallow creek. Barnes knew. They added it last fall. As they descended, Susanna felt her chest tighten. She hadn't expected to feel anything like fear, yet it sat there anyway, small and sharp. The unknown always did. The Wilson homestead was quiet when they arrived. A woman in a faded apron stepped out from the porch, wiping her hands on a cloth. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "Yates Whitlow," she said. "I'd heard you were headed south." "Plans changed," he said. "This is Susanna Orley and her children. They need work and a safe place to land." The woman came down the steps slowly, looking Susanna over with a frankness that didn't feel cruel. "You any good with bread and laundry? I can mend milk and split wood if I have to." "You'll have to," Susanna nodded once. "Then I will." The woman looked at the children. "They pitch in." "Yes," Susanna said. "They do." "All right, we'll try it a week. If it goes well, you stay." Susanna looked at Yates, but he was already leading the horses toward the fence rail. She turned back to the woman. "Thank you." The woman tilted her head. "We've all been strangers once." That night, they slept in a room above the root cellar, cool and dry, with quilts that smelled of cedar. Adam lay on a straw mattress at the foot of the bed, Amelia tucked against Susanna's side. Outside the window, the wind moved through the trees like a hush. In the barn, Yates laid his bedroll in the loft, listening to the rhythm of horses shifting below. He didn't often feel still, not really. But something about the sound of the children laughing earlier as they fed hens, the curve of Susanna's voice when she said his name, the way she hadn't asked him to stay but hadn't told him to go either, it made the quiet feel like comfort instead of emptiness. In the morning, they would wake to chores and dust and the same sun climbing over the hills. But tonight, there was warmth, a place to sleep, a reason to stay, and that felt like the start of something. The first week passed beneath long shadows and the sting of honest labor. Mornings began before the light touched the tops of the cottonwoods and ended with aching backs and quiet suppers. Susanna found rhythm in the work, kneading dough in the cool of the cellar, hanging damp linens where the wind could reach them, teaching Amelia to sort beans from chaff. It wasn't rest, but it was steadiness, and it filled her hands in a way grief could not. Adam took to the tasks quickly, learning fence repair and feed mixing under Mr. Wilson's watchful eye. The boy hardly spoke when adults were near, but Susanna noticed the way he shadowed Yates in the late afternoons, watching how he oiled saddle leather or fixed a cracked hoof pick without asking for help. Yates never said much to the boy, but he let him watch, which meant more. One evening, after the supper dishes were scrubbed clean and the children tucked into their quilts, Susanna found herself on the porch steps, watching the dusk settle over the pasture. The air held that faint green smell of new grass and old rain, and the frogs had started singing in the creek. Yates leaned against the porch post, arms crossed loosely. He hadn't gone back to the bunkhouse after dinner. "You ever think about going back east?" he asked. Eyes fixed on the darkening sky, she shook her head. "Nothing there for me and too many reminders." "Same," he said after a pause. "Though I do miss trees that reach higher than your head." Susanna brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I miss music. There used to be a man in our town who played fiddle outside the mill on Saturdays. Nothing fancy, but it stayed with you." He turned toward her. "You sing?" "Not well," she said, glancing down at her hands. "But I used to, in the evenings when the children wouldn't sleep." "What you sing?" She hesitated, then answered, "My mother's songs, mostly hymns, some lullabies." Yates nodded like he understood something she hadn't said aloud. "My ma sang too, only time we ever saw her sit still." The porch creaked beneath them as the wind picked up. A lantern flickered behind the kitchen window, casting their shadows long against the ground. "Do you plan to stay after the branding's done?" she asked, not looking at him. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low. I've been thinking about land, maybe seeing what a man could buy if he worked enough seasons. Not much, but something with water and shade, enough to keep a horse. She looked up at him. You've never said that before. I never had a reason to. The silence stretched out, but it wasn't empty. You're not just passing through anymore, she said. No, he replied, his voice steady. I'm not. A rustle came from inside Amelia, stirring in her sleep, the soft creak of the cot. Susanna stood slowly, brushing her skirt smooth. I should check on them. Yates stepped back, tipping his hat. I'll walk the fence before I turn in. She paused at the door. Yates, he looked up. Thank you for not asking me to be someone I'm not. He held her gaze. I wouldn't know how. That night, Susanna lay awake long after the children had settled, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods and the soft creak of branches against the roof. There was no fear in her chest now. Only that quiet, certain warmth that came from knowing someone had chosen to stay without needing to be asked. And for the first time in years, she let herself believe this might be a beginning. By the second month, the Wilsons no longer treated Susanna like someone passing through. Mrs. Wilson handed her the kitchen keys without ceremony, and Mr. Wilson asked her opinion on the best way to stretch the last of the flour before the next shipment arrived from Fort Bowie. Amelia had learned to fill the water pail without spilling, and Adam could lead the milk cow from the shed without prompting. Yates never said anything about the change, but Susanna noticed how he walked a little slower near the porch in the evenings, how he never saddled his horse without glancing toward the house first. She'd started leaving the door open when she sat by the hearth after supper, her mending in her lap, the children tucked in close by. Sometimes Yates stepped inside, sometimes he didn't. But the hinge no longer creaked when it opened, and that seemed like a kind of invitation. One evening, after the last calf had been branded and the cookhouse scrubbed of soot and spilled coffee, Susanna found Yates sitting on the low wall by the edge of the yard, sharpening his blade by lantern light. She walked over, brushing her palms on her skirt, and sat beside him, careful to leave a little space. You ever think you'd end up in a place like this? She asked. He tested the edge of the blade with his thumb, then wiped it clean on a strip of cloth. Truth be told, I didn't think I'd end up in a place for long. She studied the dark beyond the lantern's reach. I used to think about building a house near water, nothing big, just enough to keep warm in winter. Yates rested the knife beside him. You still could. With what? He turned to face her. With someone who knows how to raise a roof and dig a well. She looked at him, her breath catching. You offering? I'm not much for courtship, don't know how to dance or talk pretty, but I know how to work and stay put. He paused. And I've grown used to hearing your voice at the end of the day. Susanna's hand curled into the folds of her dress. I never thought I'd want to build anything again. He didn't press, just waited. She took a long breath. But I think I could with you. He stood and held out his hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it. They didn't say anything else that night. They didn't need to. The next morning, Mrs. Wilson came into the kitchen to find Susanna humming while she shaped dough into rounds. You're staying then? Susanna looked up with a quiet smile. We are. The wedding was small, just the Wilsons, the children, and the preacher from Dragoon who rode out with a Bible and a grin wider than the canyon. Amelia wore a wreath of wildflowers, and Adam stood beside Yates like he'd always belonged there. Afterward, they feasted on fresh cornbread, dried peaches, and stew thick with rabbit and beans. Yates carved a wooden spoon for Amelia and gave Adam a pocket knife he'd kept since he was a boy. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Yates and Susanna sat together on the porch, their feet brushing beneath the bench. You scared? He asked. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Not anymore. He pressed a kiss to her temple, rough hands gentle as they folded around hers. They built their own place the following spring, just east of the Wilson property near a bend in the creek where cottonwoods leaned low, and the soil stayed cool even in summer. The children helped carry stones for the hearth, and Susanna stitched curtains from flour sacks, each one edged with red thread. Yates worked the land with quiet determination, coaxing beans and squash from the earth, mending fence lines after storms, and teaching Adam how to read the sky. Amelia grew bold, chasing grasshoppers through the fields and naming all the chickens. Susanna baked bread every Saturday, humming under her breath while sunlight spilled through the windows she'd kept clean with vinegar and torn linen. They never spoke of the road behind them. There was no need. They had warmth now. They had one another. And for the first time in a long, hard stretch of years, they had peace.